You never really forget the sound of your own world breaking. It's not always a cacophony. Sometimes it's the quietest sound in the universe. The click of a latch on a suitcase, the hum of a refrigerator in a suddenly empty apartment, the space between one heartbeat and the next after someone says the words that unravel you. For me, those words were, "You're not enough for me." His name was Leo, and he said it to me over the phone, his voice crackling with a strange mix of apology and defiance, as if he were a scientist reluctantly reporting an unfortunate, but undeniable, result. We'd been together for 3 years, we had plans, we had a favorite brand of coffee, we had a drawer, you know, the couple's drawer, his toothbrush, a spare charger, the condoms, the artifacts of a shared life. And in one sentence, he reduced all of it to evidence of my insufficiency. I was standing in our kitchen. My kitchen, I'd soon start correcting myself, holding the phone so tightly I thought the screen might crack. The granite countertop was cool beneath my other hand. I remember focusing on that sensation, the hard, unyielding coldness, because it was the only solid thing in a room that had suddenly started to swim. Outside the window, I could see our neighbor Mrs. Chen watering her hanging baskets of petunias. The world was continuing its mundane rotations while mine had just stopped spinning entirely. A delivery truck rumbled past. Someone laughed on the sidewalk below. The ordinary cruelty of life's persistence in the face of personal apocalypse. "You're not enough for me." The words didn't feel like an attack, not at first. They felt like a diagnosis. A terminal one. They felt like the verdict at the end of a trial I hadn't known I was on trial for, evidence accumulated in secret, judgment passed in chambers I'd never been allowed to enter. I heard my own voice, distant and eerily calm, ask, "What does that mean, Leo? Not enough?" Even as I asked, part of me already knew. Part of me had always known. That's the thing about these relationship earthquakes. The ground has usually been trembling for months, years even, but we're so busy maintaining the facade of the building that we ignore the cracks in the foundation. He sighed, that particular sigh he reserved for when he thought I was being deliberately obtuse. It means exactly what it sounds like. I need more excitement, more ambition, more. I don't know, just more, and you're. He paused, searching for a word that would wound less. He didn't find it. You're just content to be comfortable. You don't push. You don't challenge me anymore. The irony was exquisite and excruciating. I had spent 3 years pushing myself down, smoothing my own rough edges, dimming my own light to make him feel brighter. And now he was critiquing the very docility he had cultivated in me. And here's the part that the old me, the me of 2 hours prior, would never have understood. My first, most primal emotion wasn't heartbreak. It was a bizarre, chilling clarity. It was as if his words were a key, and they unlocked a door in my mind I hadn't known was there. Behind that door was a gallery of every tiny compromise, every quiet dismissal, every time I'd made myself smaller, quieter, less me, to better fit the outline of the woman he wanted. The images came flooding back with cinematic precision. There was the night 9 months into our relationship when he'd come home, loosened his tie, poured himself a bourbon, and casually mentioned that his colleague Marcus had asked why I wasn't more ambitious. I was working at a small nonprofit, then doing community outreach, work that fed my soul even if it didn't feed my bank account. I remember the flush of shame that had crept up my neck. Not because I felt unambitious, but because Leo was looking at me with this expression. Not quite disappointment, not quite appraisal. As if he were reevaluating a purchase. I am ambitious. I'd said defensive. Just not about the same things, right? He'd said in that tone that meant wrong. But perception matters, you know. In my world, people notice these things. They notice what your partner does, what they represent. What they represent. Not who they are, what they represent. I should have heard the alarm then. Instead, I heard a challenge. I could be ambitious in ways he understood. I could make him proud in the currency he valued. 2 weeks later, I'd applied to the marketing position at a tech startup. Better salary, worse hours, work that left me feeling hollow. But Leo had beamed when I told him. He'd taken me to that expensive sushi place downtown, the one where they served the uni still moving. "This is great," he'd said, raising his sake. "You're leveling up, as if I were a video game character, not a human being with complex motivations and values. As if my worth could be quantified in salary brackets and job titles." Then there was the art internship. God, the art internship. I'd been accepted to a 6-month program at a prestigious gallery in New York, a dream opportunity that would have required me to take unpaid leave and sublet my apartment. I'd been so excited, I'd practically levitated home to tell him. I'd found him on the couch, laptop balanced on his knees, frowning at spreadsheets. "Leo, you won't believe it. I got the Morgenstern internship." He'd looked up, and I'd watched his face cycle through surprise, concern, and then a kind of patient condescension. Wow, congratulations, but we should talk about the logistics." The logistics. Over the next hour, he'd systematically dismantled my dream with the precision of a demolition expert. The financial irresponsibility of unpaid work. The impracticality of maintaining 2 residences. The reality that art world connections rarely translated to stable careers. The inconvenience of a long-distance relationship. He'd never said don't do it. He was too sophisticated for that. Instead, he'd built such an insurmountable wall of reasonable objections that by the end of the conversation, I was apologizing to him for even considering something so unrealistic. I had declined the internship. I told myself it was a mature, practical decision. I told myself that real life required compromise. I told myself that Leo was being the adult in the relationship, saving me from a beautiful mistake. But late at night, sometimes, I would lie awake and imagine the parallel version of myself walking through those gallery halls, learning from curators, touching art that touched history. That ghost self haunted me. She was the me I'd traded for the comfort of Leo's approval. The memories continued their relentless parade. The time I'd cut my hair short, really short, a pixie cut that made me feel androgynous and powerful. And he'd said, "It's interesting, different. I guess I've always been more attracted to feminine looks, but it's your hair." I'd grown it out again within 6 months. The way I'd stopped cooking the Indian food I'd grown up with because he found the smells too intense, and they lingered in the apartment. The slow, quiet death of my record collection, vinyl, jazz, and blues, and soul replaced by his algorithmic Spotify playlists optimized for productivity. The nights I pretended to like action movies more than foreign films, sitting through explosion after explosion, my mind wandering to the art house cinema 3 blocks away that I used to frequent. I thought of my friends, the ones I'd slowly, subtly distanced myself from because Leo found them dramatic or unsophisticated. Priya, who'd known me since college, who'd called me out 6 months ago over tapas and wine. "You know you're different now, right?" she'd said, not unkindly, but with the bluntness that only old friends can deploy. "Like you're performing someone else's idea of who you should be." I'd laughed it off. "I'm just growing up. We can't all stay perpetual grad students forever, Pry." The look she'd given me, sad and knowing, came back to me now with the force of prophecy. She'd seen what I couldn't or wouldn't. Within a month, our regular Tuesday dinners had dwindled to occasional text exchanges. Leo had never explicitly asked me to see her less. He'd just made sure we had plans every Tuesday. Eventually, Priya stopped suggesting alternatives. Eventually, I stopped feeling like I'd lost something irreplaceable. That was perhaps the most insidious part. The way I'd slowly anesthetized myself to my own diminishment. The way I'd started to apologize for my moods, for my need for quiet, for my intensity, as if they were flaws to be corrected. Leo was relentlessly even, keeled, priding himself on his emotional regulation, his rational approach to life. My occasional melancholies, my propensity for getting lost in thought, my need for solitude, these became problems to be managed. "You're being dark again," He'd say, not with concern but with mild irritation, as if I'd left a mess in the kitchen. "You're overthinking. You're being too sensitive." A steady drumbeat of dismissals, each one small enough to ignore, but collectively they formed a symphony of erasure. I had been sanding down my own edges for years, and he was now holding up the smoothed, bland result and saying, "See, not enough substance." The philosophical concept of the other, articulated by Simone de Beauvoir, suddenly wasn't an abstract theory from a college textbook anymore. I could see the worn cover of The Second Sex on my bookshelf across the room, sandwiched between a cookbook I never used and Leo's collection of Malcolm Gladwell. I'd read it in my early 20s, underlining passages, writing fierce annotations in the margins, certain that I would never, ever become the woman who defined herself through a man's eyes. And yet here I was. I had become the other. I had defined myself in relation to him, allowing my identity to be framed by his desires, his needs, his definition of enough. And in doing so, I had willingly participated in my own erasure. The tragedy wasn't that he saw me as not enough. It was that, for a while, I had seen myself that way too. I had internalized his metrics, adopted his value system, and used it to judge my own worth. I had become both prisoner and prison guard. So I did something that probably seems insane. I didn't cry. I didn't call my friends, the few that remained. I didn't wait for him to come home so we could have the dramatic, tear-filled showdown that this script demanded. Instead, I walked to the bedroom, opened the closet, and pulled out his suitcase. The closet itself was a monument to our relationship's power dynamics. His side was meticulously organized, shirts arranged by color, suits in garment bags, shoes in their original boxes. My side was the overflow, the afterthought, crammed into the smaller section with wire hangers and mismatched storage bins. Even our closet space had been negotiated, and I had, of course, negotiated poorly, accepting less because he needed more room for work clothes. I pulled the suitcase from the top shelf. It was expensive Italian leather, a gift from his mother, a woman who had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment and who had never quite approved of me, the scholarship student with the ethnic last name and the impractical liberal arts degree. The suitcase was heavy, well-made, designed to last, unlike us. Packing his bags was the most profound and terrifyingly empowering act of my life. It was an archaeological dig through the ruins of our relationship. Every item was a relic. I started with his dresser, the top drawer, underwear, and socks, all black, all the same brand. Leo was a man who had eliminated decision fatigue from even the most mundane aspects of life. I used to find this quirk charming, evidence of a disciplined mind. Now I saw it as symptomatic of his need for absolute control, his discomfort with variability, with spontaneity, with the beautiful mess of authentic living. I placed each folded pair in the suitcase with meditative slowness. This was not a frenzied purge. This was a ceremony. The second drawer held his T-shirts, though Leo rarely wore T-shirts outside the apartment. He had strong opinions about casual dress codes, about the importance of always being presentation ready. I pulled out a faded NYU shirt from his undergraduate years, before business school had buffed him to a professional shine. I held it up. There was a small hole near the collar. He'd kept it, this artifact of a younger, perhaps softer version of himself. I wondered when exactly he'd hardened, and whether that process had been as gradual and imperceptible to him as my own diminishment had been to me. There was the expensive watch his father had given him when he made VP, a symbol of the legacy he was so desperate to live up to. A legacy I now saw was partly about emotional stoicism, about winning, about acquisition. Leo's father had built a real estate empire through ruthless negotiation. and an almost pathological inability to show vulnerability. Leo worshipped him. I'd met him 3 times in 3 years, twice at obligatory holiday gatherings, and once at a charity gala, where he'd spent 10 minutes talking to me, primarily about property values and tax shelters, before moving on to more important connections. I'd never met Leo's father, I realized. I'd been presented to him like a painting brought for authentication, found wanting and dismissed. I placed the watch carefully in the leather case he never used, a case that itself had probably been an expensive gift. The whole apartment was full of expensive things that had been gifts, status symbols masquerading as sentimentality. There were his socks, always black, always the same brand, a man who craved order above all else. 15 pairs, I counted them, enough to go 2 weeks without doing laundry, which was about how long Leo could stretch it. I'd usually ended up doing the laundry anyway, not because he asked, but because I'd gotten tired of waiting. Another invisible labor, another small erosion. There were the books on his nightstand, and dense economic theory, biographies of great men, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, that problematic Nixon biography he'd been defending at dinner parties. My nightstand held poetry, Mary Oliver, Rumi, Ocean Vuong, and books on existentialism, Camus and Sartre and Beauvoir. The divide had always been there. I just thought it was complementary, not a chasm. He read to accumulate information, to extract utility. I read to feel less alone in the universe. These were not compatible literary philosophies. I moved to the closet and began pulling his suits. He had 7, 1 for each day of the work week, plus weekend options. I'd go to the cleaners every Saturday morning to pick up whatever he'd worn that week. Another ritual I'd adopted without questioning. I ran my hand along a charcoal pinstripe, the fabric expensive and smooth. He'd worn this to the work gala where he'd introduced me to his boss, a silver-haired man named Richard who ran the private equity firm. I'd worn a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, had spent 3 hours getting ready. Richard had shaken my hand, asked what I did, and when I'd started to explain my work at the nonprofit. This was before the tech job. His eyes had glazed over. "Ah, adieu. Gooder," he'd said, with a chuckle that indicated this was charming in the way a child's lemonade stand is charming. Cute but not serious. Leo hadn't defended me. He'd laughed along, then smoothly pivoted the conversation to something about market corrections. Later, in the car, I'd been quiet. "What's wrong?" he'd asked, though his tone suggested he already knew and was preemptively annoyed. "Nothing," I'd said, because I'd learned by then that naming these micro-aggressions made me the problem. I was too sensitive. I was reading too much into things. I couldn't take a joke. I folded his suits with a precision I usually reserved for special occasions. It wasn't an act of care. It was an act of reclamation. With every fold, I was smoothing out the wrinkles he had left on my soul. I was taking back the space he occupied, both physically and psychically. Each crease I pressed was a small declaration. This is where you end and I begin. I was, in a very real sense, performing the funeral rites for the us that had just been pronounced dead. This ritual of packing led me to a stark realization about our Western cultural narrative of love. We're sold this idea relentlessly that love is about finding your other half, that you are incomplete until you find this person who makes you whole. It's in every movie, every pop song, every fairy tale. From Jerry Maguire's "You Complete Me" to the endless rom-coms where successful women are somehow still tragically incomplete without a man, to the wedding vows that talk about becoming one. It's sold to us from childhood. Cinderella needs her prince. Sleeping Beauty needs her kiss. Even Disney's more modern princesses are defined in large part by their romantic partnerships. But that's a dangerous, debilitating myth. It sets you up for this exact moment, the moment you're told you're not a sufficient half. It frames love as a state of lack, a desperate search for completion outside of oneself. It turns relationships into rescue missions and partners into saviors or projects. It makes your worth contingent on someone else's assessment of your value. It's a recipe for exactly the kind of erasure I'd been enacting on myself. What if, instead, we started from a place of wholeness? What if love wasn't about two halves making a whole, but two wholes choosing to build something new, something greater together? What if the point wasn't completion but expansion, not filling a void but creating new dimensions? Leo came to me looking for a missing piece, and when he decided I wasn't the right shape, he discarded me. And I had let him, because I, too, had bought into the idea that I needed his piece to be complete. I thought about the relationships I'd admired from afar. My aunt and uncle, married 40 years, who still maintained separate studios, she for her painting, he for his woodworking, who spoke about their relationship not as a merger but as an alliance, two sovereign nations choosing cooperation. My friend Marcus and his husband James, who had a policy of divergent Thursdays, where they deliberately spent the evening pursuing separate interests, coming back together to share what they discovered. These were people who understood that love requires not the dissolving of boundaries, but the honoring of them. Packing his bag was my first defiant declaration of my own wholeness. With each item I placed inside, I was also removing him from the space of my psyche he'd occupied. This is yours, this is mine. These lines had blurred, but I was redrawing them now with bold, indelible ink. When I got to his drawer, the one that signaled we were serious, I had to pause. This drawer was intimate in a way the closet wasn't. The spare key to his office, labeled with a Dymo label in his compulsively neat print. A packet of gum, the kind he chewed obsessively before big meetings. Cufflinks from his father. A small, leather-bound notebook where he kept, I'd discovered once by accident, a list of his professional goals with target dates next to each one. Partner by 35, 7, figure net worth by 38, board position by 45, his life as a series of checkboxes. I wondered if I'd been on a list somewhere, serious girl, friend by 28, check, engagement by 30, that one would remain unchecked. I felt a strange relief. Imagine being married to someone who saw you as an agenda item. And then I found it, nestled beneath a tangle of charging cables, a silly, worn-out teddy bear. It was small, maybe 6 inches tall, with matted brown fur and a missing eye. One ear was stitched on with what looked like dental floss. It was profoundly, absurdly out of place in Leo's meticulously curated adult life. My breath caught. He'd shown this to me once, only once, in a moment of uncharacteristic vulnerability. It was about 8 months into our relationship. He'd caught a vicious flu, the kind that had him feverish and miserable, stripped of his usual armor of competence. I'd come over with soup and medicine, found him in bed looking small and wrecked. The fever had made him loopy, unguarded. He'd asked me to get him water, and when I'd opened his nightstand and drawer, there it was. "That's Mr. Humphrey," he'd said, his voice hoarse and somehow younger. "Had him since I was 4. I'd picked it up, charmed by this glimpse of little boy Leo. "Mr. Humphrey." I know. Stupid name. My sister named him. He'd reached for it with an unself-conscious need that made my heart crack open. My mom tried to throw him out a bunch of times, said I was too old, but I kept rescuing him from the trash. He'd held the bear while he drifted back to sleep, and I'd watched him, feeling like I'd been granted access to a secret room. This was the part of him I loved most, the hidden, soft center beneath the ambitious, polished exterior. The part that had been a little boy with a beloved stuffed animal, before his father's expectations had calcified around him like armor. We'd never talked about Mr. Humphrey again. The next day, fever broken, Leo was back to being Leo, competent, controlled, slightly embarrassed by his momentary weakness. The bear had disappeared back into the drawer, and I'd understood implicitly that we were not to speak of it. Now, holding Mr. Humphrey in the present moment, the full weight of the tragedy hit me. Leo had spent so much of his life burying the parts of himself that didn't fit the narrative of success and strength. The soft parts, the uncertain parts, the parts that needed comfort. He'd learned early that vulnerability was a liability, that to be taken seriously, he had to be hard, decisive, relentless. And he'd chosen a partner, me, who represented a different way of being, someone who cried at movies and sat with difficult emotions and valued tenderness. Perhaps he'd thought I could carry those qualities for both of us, that he could outsource his own softness. But you can't outsource your own humanity. It doesn't work. And when he looked at me and saw not enough, what he was really seeing was a mirror reflecting all the parts of himself he'd rejected. My contentment reminded him of all the peace he'd sacrificed for achievement. My emotional openness reminded him of the vulnerability he'd learned to bury. My willingness to prioritize meaning over status threatened the entire edifice he'd built his identity on. For a moment, the dam of my numbness threatened to break. I held the bear, this symbol of the boy he used to be, the boy who might have thought I was more than enough, the boy who hadn't yet learned to quantify human worth in metrics of ambition and productivity. I felt tears finally starting to well up, not for the loss of Leo the man, but for the loss of Leo the boy, the one who'd been slowly suffocated by expectations until only the hard shell remained. And then I placed Mr. Humphrey gently on top of his sweaters, nestling him among the cashmere like he was being tucked into bed. I wasn't packing away a monster. I was packing away a man, a complex, flawed human being who was as trapped in the same toxic narratives as I was. He was searching for enough. In the external world. An enough career, an enough girlfriend, an enough life. Never realizing that the emptiness he was trying to fill was a void no external thing could ever satisfy. My anger began to melt into a profound, aching pity. His sentence was his truth, but it was also his prison. He would probably find someone else, I realized, someone more polished, more ambitious in the ways he valued, more willing or able to play the part he needed in his life's production. And maybe for a while, that person would feel like enough. But eventually, the hollowness would creep back in, because Leo was trying to solve an internal problem with external solutions. He was trying to fill the void left by the boy, who'd had to hide his teddy bear with achievements and acquisitions, and the perfect partner. It would never work. Not until he found his way back to Mr. Humphrey, but that was his journey to make, not mine. I zipped the suitcase closed. The sound was definitive, a full stop. The teeth of the zipper coming together felt like sutures closing a wound. I wheeled it to the front door and set it upright. It stood there like a monolith, a stark black monument to the end of our story. The apartment suddenly felt cavernous. I'd never noticed how much space Leo took up. Not just physical space, though he was tall and broad, shouldered, but psychic space. The energy it took to calibrate myself to his moods, to anticipate his needs, to maintain the version of myself he preferred. With him packed away, the apartment didn't feel empty. It felt exhaled. I walked through the rooms, seeing them as if for the first time. The art on the walls, we'd chosen it together, which meant he'd chosen it and I'd agreed. Abstract pieces, expensive, from galleries he'd researched as good investments. I'd wanted the strange, colorful print I'd found at a street market in Portland. A piece by a local artist that depicted a woman made of flowers and birds. It's a bit much, he'd said. Not really our aesthetic. Our aesthetic. His aesthetic. It hung somewhere in my parents' garage now. The furniture was all clean lines and neutral tones. Grown-up furniture, Leo called it. I'd had a vintage velvet couch in jewel green when we'd moved in together. Let's upgrade, he'd suggested, and somehow my couch had ended up on Craigslist, and we'd spent a weekend shopping at stores where single chairs cost more than my monthly student loan payment. Even the refrigerator contents told the story. His protein shakes and meal prep containers, my slowly dying herbs, and the fancy cheese. I'd bought on a whim, and then felt guilty about eating. The kitchen had become his domain because he was better at planning. I'd once loved to cook, experiments and failures and glorious messes. Now I made grilled chicken and steamed vegetables on repeat. I'd been living in Leo's world, I realized. I'd been a guest in my own life. Then I took a single yellow sticky note from the pad we kept by the phone for taking messages, though who leaves phone messages anymore? Another relic of pretending to be more established than we were. I didn't write a novel. I didn't curse him out or beg for an explanation. I had already received the only explanation that mattered. I wrote 2 words, "You're right." And I meant it in a way he would never understand. He was right that I wasn't enough. For him. I wasn't enough to fill the void in his soul. I wasn't enough to quiet his insecurities. I wasn't enough to prop up his fragile ego. I wasn't enough to play the supporting role in his life's narrative, to be the accessory that signaled his success, to be the mirror that reflected only what he wanted to see, and thank God for that, because that was a job I was never meant to apply for. That was a job that would have killed me slowly, a death by 1,000 small acceptances of less. I stuck the note to the suitcase handle. It was my thesis statement, the summary of my unexpected doctoral defense in the philosophy of self-worth. Then I did the second most important thing I did that day. I poured myself a glass of cold water. Not wine, though God knows I wanted it. Not the expensive whiskey Leo kept in the cabinet for impressing colleagues. Just water, cold and clean and clear. I filled a glass from the tap, added ice, and held it for a moment, feeling the condensation on my palm. This simple act felt revolutionary. No performance, no signaling. Just the basic human act of quenching thirst. I walked to the living room window, and I watched the sun begin to set over the city. Our apartment, my apartment, was on the 7th floor, high enough to see beyond the immediate street to the sprawl of the city beyond. I stood there as the sky turned from blue to orange to a deep, bruised purple. I watched the lights in the thousands of other windows flicker on, each one a story, a life, a universe of joy and pain. How many people in those windows were having their own world-breaking moments? How many were sitting in bathrooms crying, standing in kitchens deciding whether to stay or go, lying in beds next to people who'd become strangers? How many were celebrating, making love, making dinner, making do? The sheer volume of human experience happening simultaneously was overwhelming and oddly comforting. My heartbreak was singular to me and utterly universal in the same breath. I thought about my grandmother, who'd fled during partition with 2 suitcases and 4 children, who'd lost her home and half her family and somehow built a new life in a strange city. She'd once told me, in her kitchen while teaching me to make chai, "The worst thing that happens to you becomes a part of you, Beta, but it doesn't have to become all of you. You are always more than your worst moment." At the time, I'd nodded politely, not really understanding. I understood now, and I let myself feel it all. The grief, yes, for the future we had planned. The apartment we were going to look for. Something bigger, with room for an office and maybe, someday, a nursery, though we'd never quite agreed on the timeline. The wedding that had been abstractly discussed. He wanted something elegant and small. I'd wanted something joyful and chaotic. Another incompatibility we'd papered over. The life I'd imagined, which I could now see had always been a fantasy. A version of events where Leo slowly softened and I slowly sharpened, and somehow we met in the middle. The shame for having made myself small. This was perhaps the hardest emotion to sit with. The anger at Leo was cleaner, simpler, but the shame was complicated because it meant acknowledging my own complicity. No one had held a gun to my head. I'd made choices, bad choices, choices driven by fear and insecurity and the seductive comfort of being chosen. I'd betrayed myself 1,000 small times. How do you forgive yourself for that? The terrifying fear of being alone. I was 31 years old, The last time I'd been truly single, I'd been 26, a different person in a different world. The thought of dating again, the apps, the small talk, the vulnerability, made me want to crawl into bed and never emerge. And beyond the dating, there was the simpler, more primal fear. Who would I be without someone to define myself against? I'd spent my 20s becoming an adult in relation to partners. I'd gone from a college boyfriend to a post-grad situation, shipped to Leo, each relationship a frame I'd poured myself into. Who was I, unframed, but also simmering beneath it all, a new, unfamiliar sensation, a sense of vast, open possibility. It felt like the first breath of cold, clean air after being in a stuffy room for years. It felt like standing at the edge of something enormous and unknowable. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. I could do anything, not in the toxic, positivity, Instagram, caption way, but in the simple, literal way. I could move to another city. I could quit the tech job I'd only taken to please him and figure out what work actually called to me. I could cut my hair however I wanted. I could fill this apartment with weird art and secondhand furniture and the smell of spices. I could say yes to things without first calculating how Leo would react. I could say no without guilt. I could start the long, difficult, necessary work of becoming acquainted with myself again. With the self I'd been before Leo, and more importantly, with the self I was becoming after him. The Japanese have a concept called ma, the space between things, the pause that gives meaning to what surrounds it. My relationship with Leo had been without ma, constant togetherness, constant compromise, constant calibration. Now I had nothing but ma, empty space, silence, the pause. It felt like possibility wearing the disguise of pain. I didn't know what came next. I didn't have a plan. The entire architecture of my life had just been demolished. But as I looked out at that city, I realized something fundamental. The rubble was not my tomb, it was my building site. For the first time in a long time, the only person I had to be enough for was myself. And in that silent, empty apartment, standing in the ruins of a love that had tried to define me, I felt a flicker of the terrifying, magnificent truth. I was not enough, and not insufficient. Just I was. Present tense, singular, whole. When I heard his key in the lock later that evening, my heart didn't flutter with panic. It was steady. I'd wondered if he might not come back at all tonight, if he'd crash at Marcus's place or book a hotel room. But here he was, probably expecting to find me distraught, ready for the conversation where he magnanimously agreed to give me another chance if I could just try harder. Be better, want less, need less, be less. I didn't move from my spot at the window. The sky was fully dark now, stars invisible under the light pollution, the city glowing like embers. I heard the door open, the pause, the rustle of the sticky note. I knew he was reading those two words, trying to decode them. You're right. Was it capitulation, sarcasm, agreement? I heard a longer, heavier silence. I knew he was looking at the suitcase, at the finality of it. I imagined his face, the confusion, maybe a flicker of hurt pride. He'd expected tears, drama, a fight for him. Men like Leo always expect to be fought for. The most profound rejection is acceptance. He didn't call my name. There was no shouting, no attempt to come find me and hash things out. Perhaps he recognized the closure for what it was. Perhaps he was relieved. Now he could be the victim in his own narrative, the man whose girlfriend had coldly packed his bags. Never mind that he'd fired the opening shot. People will always rearrange history to star in their own movies. After another moment, I counted to 30 in my head. I heard the door close again, softer this time. The click of the latch was the quietest sound in the universe and the loudest. It was over. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. My knees went weak and I sank to the floor right there by the window, my back against the wall, and finally, I cried. Not delicate tears, but huge, gasping sobs that came from somewhere deep in my chest. I cried for the girl I'd been, so desperate to be chosen that she'd unchosen herself. I cried for the 3 years I'd spent building a relationship that had been, in hindsight, doomed by incompatibility and cowardice, his and mine. I cried because I was free and because freedom was fucking terrifying. I cried until I was empty, and then when the tears subsided and I was left hiccuping and raw, faced on the hardwood floor, I felt something shift. It was subtle tectonic, a settling, an alignment. I was alone in an apartment that suddenly felt like mine. The night stretched ahead of me, unscheduled. I could do anything. I could do nothing. I could order the Indian food Leo had found too pungent and eat it with my hands straight from the container. I could blast music he found juvenile. I could leave dishes in the sink. I could take up all the space. Small freedoms, maybe, but they felt enormous. The story of my boyfriend said you're not enough for me isn't a story about being left. It's a story about choosing to stay in your own life, in your own truth, in your own worth. It's about understanding that when someone tells you you're not enough for them, they are handing you a key. You can use it to lock yourself in a prison of their making, accepting their judgment as objective truth. Or you can use it to unlock the door and walk out into the vast, uncertain, and breathtakingly beautiful landscape of your own becoming. In the days that followed, I would stumble. I would wake up reaching for him and find empty space. I would have moments of doubt, wondering if I'd been too hasty, too proud, if I should have fought harder or compromised more. I would draft texts I wouldn't send. I would stalk his social media until I had to block him for my own sanity. I would wonder who he was with, if he missed me, if he'd already found someone enough. But I would also have moments of unexpected joy. The first time I rearranged the furniture to my liking, the apartment suddenly felt like it could breathe. The first time I went to that art house cinema alone and watched a 3-hour Iranian film and walked out feeling fed in a way I'd forgotten was possible. The first time I said yes to drinks with Priya and told her everything, and she'd held my hand and said, "Welcome back," I would slowly, tentatively begin the work of excavating myself from the rubble. I'd find pieces I'd forgotten existed. I'd discover new pieces I'd never known were there. I'd learn that the opposite of being enough for someone else wasn't being not enough. It was being whole unto yourself. I'd learn that love, real love, doesn't require you to be less so someone else can feel like more. Real love is two people who are already complete, already whole, choosing to build something new together without dismantling themselves in the process. It's not about completing each other, but about complementing each other. It's not about filling voids, but about creating expansiveness. I'd learned that being alone isn't the same as being lonely, that solitude can be chosen and nourishing rather than inflicted and hollow. That you can be your own good company if you take the time to become someone you actually like. I'd learned that there is no objective measure of enough. Enough is not a fixed quantity. It's not a checkbox on someone else's list. It's a moving target, a personal metric, a question only you can answer for yourself. 3 months later, I would quit the tech job. 6 months later, I would apply for and receive a grant to work with a community arts organization, doing work that felt meaningful even though it paid badly. A year later, I would wake up in a different apartment, one I'd chosen myself, filled with weird art and mismatched furniture, the smell of coffee and cardamom, and I would realize I hadn't thought about Leo in 3 full days. 18 months later, I would run into him at a mutual friend's wedding. He'd be there with someone new, a woman in a tasteful sheath dress with a corporate law job and an MBA from Wharton. She'd be lovely. She'd be, by his metrics, impressive, and I would feel nothing. Not anger, not jealousy, not even much curiosity. Just a mild, distant sense of good luck to both of you. I'd be there alone, by choice, having turned down 3 separate offers to bring a +1. I wouldn't need an accessory to feel complete. He'd approach me at one point slightly drunk on bourbon and nostalgia. "You look good." He'd say, "Different, happy." "I am." I'd say simply, "I've thought about you, about us, about whether I made a mistake." He'd say this as if it were a gift, this admission. "You didn't." I'd say, and I'd mean it kindly, "We weren't right for each other, but I hope you're good, Leo. I really do." And I would. because by then, I'd understand that his inability to see me as enough said everything about him and nothing about me. His metrics weren't universal laws. They were just his metrics, and I didn't have to accept them as my own. But all of that was in the future. On this night, the night of the breaking and the packing and the quiet click of the latch, I didn't know any of that yet. I only knew that something had ended and something else tentative, fragile, wholly mine, had begun. Your absence, Leo, was the catalyst for my presence. Thank you for the breaking. Thank you for the brutal gift of your honesty, even if you didn't understand its true meaning. Thank you for saying the words that unlocked the door. I'm walking through it now. I'm walking into the wide, unknown world of myself, and I'm enough.